Welcome, everybody. My name is Jessica Jacobson, and I'm the Program Manager for Research and Insights here at the Skoll Center. In today's Insights for Action seminar, we're really excited to be discussing leadership for net zero. So that's how businesses are leading this work in a few different ways, the challenges they're facing in this work, and the leadership practices required by business and others. So I'm delighted to introduce our speakers today. We have Dr. Aoife Brophy, who's a lecturer in innovation and enterprise, jointly appointed between Saïd Business School and the Smith School. We have Kaya Axelson, the Net Zero Policy Engagement Fellow at Oxford Net Zero. And our discussant, Professor Mariah Besharov, who's the Professor of Organizations and Impact at Saïd Business School and the Academic Director here at the Skoll Center. So welcome everyone, thanks so much for joining us. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We are recording this and we will make it available on our YouTube channel after. And the other thing is we really want an active chat during this, so we won't have a Q&A at the end, but if you have any questions or comments throughout, just pop that in the chat and we'll integrate it into the conversation. We're also going to pose some questions to you in the chat during this, so feel free to respond there, and we'd love to hear your thoughts and hear your views. So without further ado, I'd love to kick this off with a bit of introduction and context setting from you, Aoife and Kaya. Can you tell us a little bit about your research on leadership for net zero, how this fits into Oxford Net Zero's broader agenda, and why this work is so urgent and important at the moment? So over to you both.
Kaya, would you like to get us started on net zero and how this fits in with Oxford Net Zero?
Absolutely. Wonderful to be here, everyone. My name is Kaya Axelson, and I work for Oxford Net Zero, which is an interdisciplinary research program at the University of Oxford, bringing together the business school, of course, the policy school, geography, geology, biology, you name it. It's an interdisciplinary program, and we are dedicated entirely to informing effective climate action on the map to net zero. So what we do is, and what I do is a lot of engagement to ensure that the science is getting into the hands of folks who I hope are on this call who are practitioners. And this report was really inspired by Aoife and my interest in helping corporate leaders understand what the emerging practices on this net zero landscape are like. So we have an incredible tool called the Zero Tracker. So if you go to zerotracker.net, you can find it. And it looks at kind of global progress to net zero. And it's the first qualitative systematic global review of net zero targets. And within that, we found a lot of variation in the way that corporations are setting net zero targets, but also in the ways that they are aiming to achieve them. So in particular, and of particular interest to us, were the gaps in the way that corporations were thinking about scope and where they kind of draw the line around their emissions, and how they think about offsetting, whether to offset, what to offset, how to offset. So Aoife and I are going to get into those two topics, and we've had a really fantastic time interviewing corporate leaders in the sustainability space about this.
Great, yeah, and I think just to set this work in context, even kind of more broadly beyond Oxford Net Zero, we're seeing now already kind of impacts of the climate crisis that we were not anticipating to see until much later, post 2050. And I think the urgency, especially in the lead up to COP26, with lots of businesses deciding to develop targets for net zero for the first time. There's a lot of momentum building and a real understanding that we're running out of time and we need to focus on accelerating action. And so Kaya and I have been really interested in trying to dig into, okay, it's one thing to have a target, but how are these targets actually being implemented in practice? And so we talked to a number of companies, particularly in the food and tech sectors, because we identified that those sectors are quite advanced in thinking about scope and in thinking about offsetting. We wanted to understand what we can learn from those companies who are a little bit more at the forefront of thinking about these things. They're still facing challenges, so that we can improve the guidance that's being given to companies, because there's so much guidance out there, and there are so many different terms that a lot of companies are struggling to get their heads around. What's the difference between net zero and carbon neutrality, for example? And so we basically wanted to kind of map that landscape and then dig in a bit more detail to understand how are these targets actually being implemented inside companies, and what can we learn in particular from these two industries.
Thanks, Aoife and Kaya. I mean, a follow-up question. Aoife, you mentioned some confusion around key terms and key concepts. And in the chat, Lydia has asked everyone, what is the jargon that you're grappling with in this field? And be really helpful just to get us all on the same page if you could introduce some of the key concepts that you're discussing today and the language that you think we should all be using in this work. I'm also thinking about the conversation we had in last month's seminar with Dr. Jessica Omokuti, who I know works with you both at Oxford Net Zero, and Raj Agrawal, about the importance of really centering this in issues of equity and justice. And I'd love to hear how your work engages with that as well.
So I'll just jump in on some of the net zero jargon, because I think before we start a discussion on this, and as we've done with those that we've interviewed, it's good to be clear on terms. In particular, how is net zero different from carbon neutral? I think that's the main distinction that is really confusing people. In theory, the two should be the same, they should be synonyms. But in practice, what we're seeing and what we kind of outline in the report is that carbon neutral has become sort of a term for offsetting without a lot of conditions, and net zero is kind of taking on a little bit more stringency as a standard evolves around net zero. And as we say in the report, the standards are very much emerging. So we make a distinction there. There's also an important difference between kind of carbon neutral and net zero around the timeline over which that balance needs to be held. With a lot of kind of carbon neutral claims, companies have sort of added up their emissions and then said, look, we've invested in carbon credits to the same tune or amount, but without any kind of guarantees that those credits are lasting or really balance out the emissions sources. And so I think net zero comes from the scientific community. We have had, in Oxford, we've had a hand in really understanding the role of cumulative emissions and therefore putting net zero forward. And we'd really like to keep those scientific basis and those standards high by understanding that it's a balance in the atmosphere that we have to achieve. And so one of the questions we really grapple with in this report, and that's actually the title of the report, is it net zero for my company as like this sort of individual moment in time where you've invested in all the credits and then you're like, we're good? Or is it my company for the global goal of net zero? And I think that there's a real shift coming around where people are starting to think more on the second. But I think that there's also a tension there, because there is a question of accounting and responsibility and getting to net zero for my company that really has to be considered quite carefully as well.
Yeah, and I think just to pick up, Jessica, on this question of justice and linking to the session that you had with Jessica, I think it's so important. Language is so important to shaping how we even think about doing business. Right? We know that from so many different contexts that it's important to, language is almost like an institution. It helps us to think about how we're categorizing things that we do, what's possible. And we're seeing a lot of companies grappling with this, trying to even connect net zero to many other priorities that they may have already had in view in thinking about their role in society. And so we're seeing the companies that are at the forefront are really using this opportunity and the momentum created by climate and net zero to connect with many other priorities that are connected to climate. And that can be issues of equality, of health, of employment. And we would encourage a much more holistic a much more holistic approach from companies to their net zero targets and their net zero strategies as a whole. We're on the equity side, we're just seeing that there isn't really as much leadership as yet in integrating equity into and justice into the approaches for net zero. It's a really big area for more work and more research to be done. And Kaya and I decided that it wasn't really, there wasn't enough emerging best practice for us to actually lean into and to understand from the companies that we were engaging with what could and should be done in the space. Having said that, I think there are differences across sectors, and this is on kind of justice and equity issues. I think the food and drinks industry is a little bit further ahead in thinking about how to even think about equity and justice, and how to think particularly about livelihoods of farmers within supply chains. There are some efforts among some companies to try to measure these things, but in measuring, I would also caution companies to think a bit more broadly about what justice and equity actually is, to have conversations with stakeholders, to actually dig in at this point when we just don't have very clear metrics for companies in different industries, to be approaching this topic in a much more holistic way. So I think we are kind of seeing the beginnings of leadership emerging in certain places, but it's definitely a space that needs more work in the practitioner space and in research.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I wanted to just add to that to say that the more holistic approach that Aoife is talking about does make room for an equity perspective. I mean, what equity really means is not just that everyone has to do the same thing. That's kind of an equality perspective that doesn't respect the fact that people are starting from different starting lines. And so if you think about my company for net zero as a global target, that means maybe I'm going to go a little further faster if I've had a little bit of a leg up because of where my company is based or what resources we started with. And that, I think, brings in the equity perspective a lot better than just this sort of individualistic approach.
Thanks so much, both of you. I think another key term implicit in all of this is leadership. We're using it again and again, and I think we'll come back to exactly what you mean in your report on that. But you're showing how businesses are themselves leading this work at the forefront of this work. Mariah, I'd love to bring you in to get your response on this leadership perspective, drawing on your body of work on leadership in business within and between organizations. How do you think that business, individual companies think about leadership in this space, and what do you think they're missing in this work?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jessica. I think a few things to clarify here. One is there are clearly different meanings of leadership. One meaning is really about the individual and the leader, but a lot of the way that we're talking about leadership in this report and in what you've heard from Kaya and Aoife is about the organizational and institutional leadership of firms and their role in society. And that's equally important. And of course, one can facilitate the other, right? The individual leaders at the helm of these organizations are integral in positioning their organizations through their practices, as well as through their advocacy and sharing work to be organizational and really institutional leaders in this space. So a first key point here is to recognize and distinguish the individual leader from the leadership of the organization and the institution. And I think the report provides a lot of insight into what are the practices that organizations need to be thinking about from their organizational and institutional leadership perspective to really advance towards net zero. At the same time, to do that, we have to think about what does that mean individual leaders in these organizations need to do. And this is not just the one individual at the top, but also the set of individuals across multiple layers of the organization who have a stake in the organization's success, and of course, in the success and the continuation really of the world that we live in. And so here, I think the challenge is to shift from treating net zero as separate from the core of the organization to really integral to it. And so, yes, we need a net zero strategy, but ultimately we need a strategy of which net zero is a core component and is seen that way and accepted as such by members of the organization. So that really requires a mindset shift, right? We have to start thinking differently about this as something that's a separate part of what we do to being integral to what we do, and then to shift the culture and structure of organizations to accomplish that, right? To not have this only be in a separate part of the organization by separate roles or separate individuals. Of course, there's a lot of deep expertise that's required to do this well, but it has to be as well integrated across the entire organization. That has implications for the kinds of jobs that people have, for the kinds of careers that people build. And ultimately, I think, even though it's quite challenging, it offers a lot of opportunity to make much more meaningful work across the entire organization, not just in one piece of the organization.
Thanks so much, Mariah. I want to deep dive a little bit into each of the two practices that you've mentioned. Before we do that, I just wanted to flag, we've put some questions for you in the chat. We recognize we've got 70-something people in the room, lots of experts, would really appreciate your views. And that will also feed back into the report, as Aoife and Kaya finalize it. Thank you, Bethan, for asking when it's coming out. Soon, it's coming out really soon. It's in final design. But if you have any great insights, it's not too late to incorporate those. So please respond in the chat. So yes, to deep dive into these two areas, Aoife, I'd love to ask you a bit more about scope coverage. Can you just tell us a little bit more about what that is, what's included in that, and some of the ways that businesses are going beyond existing protocols and challenges that they're facing in that work?
Yes, of course, and I think it fits really nicely with Mariah's comments. Actually, thinking very much about integrating net zero with strategy, because scopes, we're really talking about kind of the boundaries of the emissions that we include in what a company is responsible for, essentially. And we have kind of three main scopes of emissions that have been around for quite a long time, actually. We have the GHG protocol that has developed a very clear guidance on categorizing scope 1 and 2 emissions. So scope 1 is direct emissions, so anything that's under the direct control of an organization. So any kind of heat that I'm generating on site, those emissions fall under scope 1. Scope 2 is indirect emissions from the purchase of heat and electricity. So that's everything that I'm using in my buildings, for example, to provide lighting for offices, but I'm purchasing from an energy supplier. And then scope 3 emissions are everything that is upstream and downstream in my entire value chain. And so we have this very clear guidance on how to categorize these types of emissions in thinking about the types of activities that I am involved in as a company, or indeed as a government or any kind of actor. That guidance has been very useful in helping companies to account for their emissions, and increasingly we're seeing the coverage of emissions from those who are holding companies to account, push for a greater focus on the entire value chain, so entire scope 3 emissions. And many companies are starting to at least account for their scope 3 and then include scope 3 emissions as part of their targets. So we see in the report, we show the differences across sectors in the extent of scope 1, 2, and 3 targets, and the leaders that we talk to are very focused on trying to set targets for scope 3. They've all set targets for their scope 3 emissions, but they're still trying to figure out where they actually start with making reductions in those emissions, because the entire value chain involves my supply chains, but also downstream emissions of customers using my products, for example. And so that's getting into quite an extensive amount of responsibility that that companies are taking for the emissions in their entire value chain. But at the same time, and this is the really interesting piece that we're seeing in the leading kind of companies in this space, many companies are saying it's not enough to focus on scope 3 emissions. And actually the guidance is kind of, out of date at this point. We need to be going beyond scope 3 and actually breaking out of this kind of very clear static almost categorization of the emissions that we're responsible for. And so some companies are kind of trying to push those boundaries and say, okay, well, we need to actually be engaging much more with what's kind of being called scope 4, scope 5, and scope 6 emissions even. So scope 4 would be kind of thinking about the responsibility for emissions that might come from your employees who are working remotely, for example, their homes, the emissions that are associated with them using their gas boilers, then that would be included in your company's kind of, scope 4 emissions. And other companies, I think, and this is where it gets really interesting, are starting to say, okay, well, we need to actually just be stepping back and thinking about our entire business model. What are we doing? What kind of value are we creating? And this goes to kind of Mariah's point about this mindset shift, not trying to look at doing less harm by reducing these emissions, but actually just reconceptualizing what we're doing. And breaking out of these categorizations in some ways, although they can be very helpful in encouraging action. And so there's this really interesting tension in we want companies to go beyond and to be kind of thinking creatively, but at the same time, we don't want to be stopping action from happening right now. And I think this is kind of the critical tension with climate. We need action immediately, but we also need to sustain that action over a long period of time. And that's a very difficult thing for companies to do and to do effectively. And that's where we kind of need to really be providing guidance, I think, in how to do this creatively and to foster conversations within industries and across industries of how to do that well.
Thanks so much, Aoife. Mariah, I'd love to just bring you in to respond to some of what Aoife has said about, firms thinking differently about their role in society.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Aoife. Your comments prompted a bunch of thoughts based on the work that I've done and others have done on leadership and the challenges of managing the kinds of trade-offs that you were just referring to in terms of immediate action and longer term action, but also in terms of how far down the chain do we go with respect to scope, right? And we're beyond scope 3 now, even talking about that. It's really a fundamental rethinking of sort of what is our role, right? And from an isolated entity to part of this really deeply interconnected system for which we have some responsibility, right? Significant responsibility potentially. At the same time, we still have to think about our role as a firm, right? And our success and viability as a firm. And so that too, can generate this sense of there's a trade-off or there's a tension there. And I first just want to highlight that this area is rife with these kinds of seeming trade-offs and tensions, right? There's the time horizon, there's the individual firm as compared to the system and the collective. There's the core of the business as compared to the part that perhaps historically has dealt with sustainability issues. And there's an implication for how do we lead then, right? Not just what are the practices of the organization, but what's our mindset? As you were saying, we need to really shift that mindset away from thinking about making a choice of one or the other to doing both. And we talk about this as both and leadership rather than either or leadership. And it very much starts with what's in our heads, right? How do we think about this problem and what to do about it? First of all, from just a problem to an opportunity, right? And an opportunity to find ways of transcending the trade-offs, right? In some situations, there may absolutely be a trade-off between what we need to do best today and what we need to do best in the long term, for example. But often there are ways of finding creative solutions that at a moment in time and certainly over time allow us to do both. And that's sort of at the core of this both and leadership, is looking for those opportunities, being willing to be malleable in your decision making to change the way you allocate resources. Today, it might be this choice. Tomorrow, it might be that side of the trade-off, right? So that there's more dynamism in how you're making these kinds of decisions, so that at least over time, it's not either or, it's more of a both and approach. And then of course you need people, voices, metrics to hold you to that, right? To say, well, how are we going to know if we're really within the bounds that we need to be in, and how are we going to hold ourselves to those priorities, especially the longer term, the ones that don't always historically have voices in the conversation and at the table. And I talk about those as building guardrails for your organization.
Thanks so much, Mariah. Aoife and Kaya, I just want to give you a chance to respond if there's anything you wanted to say before I move on.
Yeah, I'd love to just develop that a little bit more, Mariah, in terms of, what kinds of things should companies be doing? If we think about kind of this kind of both and approach and leadership, how does that manifest itself, particularly in the context of climate, and what kinds of, I would imagine we need kind of those kinds of skills of leaders in different parts of organizations, for example. And I wonder what the kind of practical implications of that might be in the context of climate.
Yeah, no, I think it's an important and complex question. I mean, I think one way, for example, it shows up is thinking about what are we doing internally as a firm, and where are we, and how are we sharing and collaborating and developing best practices that are across our value chain and with other competitors who are perhaps similarly positioned in the value chain. So it's sort of the horizontal and the vertical sharing and collaboration, which of course has to some extent gone on in many arenas of business historically, but often is not the dominant mode of interaction, right? It's more of a competition approach and mindset. And so that's one way where I see this showing up very concretely, is shifting the kinds of conversations we're in, the kinds of modes of engaging, to be actively seeking that collaboration, that knowledge sharing across the value chain. In addition to thinking about what are we doing internally, right? So more in the scope 1, scope 2, but really starting to expand that. Again, we talk about co-opetition, right? That's sort of, we're starting to get into that space here. So I think I see that as one big arena. Who else are we talking to? Who are we sharing with, learning from, working with on this? Because even if we're taking responsibility as a firm, it really has to be part of a collective effort.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think what we're seeing is that companies are really struggling with how to do this in practice, right? So it's there is an appetite for many companies to partner with competitors, for example, to be able to improve things in certain supply chains. But there's also a bit of a hesitancy and some legal barriers to being able to do that. And I think that's one of the areas that we've identified as really requiring more research to be able to identify kind of the different levers at different levels that are required for these types of kind of conversations and interactions to lead to systemic kind of change. And I think that's a really interesting area for further practical and academic work.
Absolutely. And I'm seeing a question in the chat that I think relates to this. And Fidesz, it's from you. I think this is a question that many folks probably have. And I tried to speak to it earlier, and I want to just say a bit more. It's a question about, it's not businesses or organizations that adopt a leadership practice. It's people who adopt practices. And I think this is where sometimes our language can get in the way or can be confusing, just like we were speaking earlier about some of the challenges of being clear about what net zero means, for example. And so here, I think we want to think about the organizational practices that make organizations leaders in the space of moving towards net zero, as well as the individual practices that people in organizations adopt as they lead them to facilitate their organizations moving towards net zero. And so both are leadership practices, if you will. Some are practices of the organization as a whole, policies, et cetera, formal policies, and others are behaviors that we see individual leaders exhibiting to help move organizations in the direction of net zero. And we're really talking across the spectrum of all of those. And I think I'm bringing the individual leadership perspective in. The report that Kaya and Aoife have developed and the research that they've done is really about foregrounding the organizational practices that position firms as leaders in this space.
I think I wanted to respond to that because I think it really gets to the heart of the questions of both scope and of offsetting, which in terms of scope, where do you draw a line around what the organization's responsibilities are when you're even more distant from those people than you would be in, say, your scope 1? And so the scope 3 question was brought up again and again. How do we know if our consumer is going to take a bath more if we sell a bath bomb, for example? That's the kind of question that these companies are asking. Because, my company offers a streaming service, are people using their computers more, which is then leading to energy demand? Well, technically that's not inside the greenhouse gas removal, or the greenhouse gas protocol responsibility for scope 3. And yet, because the public sees that kind of those streaming services as driving demand, companies are now realizing that they have to sort of reach outside and then engage with the IT companies. So it's really about collaboration, as Maria said. And I think it really highlights that, to Fidesz's point, like, we are having to suddenly engage everyone. We have to mobilize absolutely everyone in a supply chain. And that's a really hard thing to do, which is why we need all of you really skilled up on all this.
Just to add to that, I'm seeing a comment from Matthew Ling about noting that, as customers, right, Kaya, as you're noting, right, we make choices, right, and we can choose to give our business to particular organizations. We can also choose what to do with the products, what products and services we buy and what to do with them, right? And so I think at this level, we're really talking about leadership of all of us as individuals in the choices that we make, in our own behavior, in the way in which we work with, through, at the helm of organizations, and the way in which we develop those organizations to have particular policies and practices.
Great, thanks everyone. I've had a couple of private questions as well, which I'm just going to summarize, just to take a step back before we dive into offsetting with Kaya. Some questions just to get context on the sample for the report. So I wonder, Aoife and Kaya, if you could just tell us an overview of the sample, just to get a sense of what kinds of companies you included, what regions they represent, what sectors they represent, the size of companies, whether they're the usual suspects that we might imagine, the Patagonias, or other sort of less expected actors.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually have a graphic I can show if that's helpful as to our case selection process. So because a lot of the practices are really emergent, we wanted to focus on successful or sort of leading, pushing the front edge companies. So, we start with the question of, which are these companies? These are the companies that are signing up to the RE100. They're signing up to the Race to Zero. They're signing up to these kind of like voluntary initiatives that are starting to drive and create net zero standards that may or may not become regulation in the future. And I think that's part of why interviewing those companies is interesting to us. If they're at the front edge, defining what good is, what can we learn from that, and how will good end up in the end? So we also wanted to look at large companies because these questions of sort of scope and offsetting are particularly interesting for companies that are dealing with like large supply chains. And so this is just a quick visual where you can see for tech and media kind of the Venn diagram of the companies that we chose. We wanted to make sure, of course, that the companies we chose are reporting on scope 3 and have a target that covers scope 3. It's kind of shocking how few do have that, which just shows how important this work is. And then there's kind of a Venn diagram here where you say, do they have a net zero target rather than, say, a carbon neutral target? And do they have kind of a plan to offset or 100% renewable, the same for food and consumables? So thanks for the question.
Thanks, Kaya.
Oh, one more really important thing, because I was looking at Aoife, I was reminded to say this, that we really thought that companies, there's a theoretical background to our case selection, that companies that are most consumer facing are under the most pressure to move faster on leadership practices. So that's why we chose media, tech, and consumer goods.
Just to also say that we use the data that the Net Zero Tracker team have put together, and that's based on the Forbes 2000 list. So it's very large companies that have operations in many different regions. We do see some regional differences in the types of targets that are set, the types of language that are used. But we don't really go into a lot of detail in trying to explain where that variation comes from in this report. And so we do some analysis of the targets of these companies that feature in the database, and then we interviewed some of the companies from the food and tech sectors to kind of get some deeper insights on how scope and offsetting in particular are being implemented and thought about in these companies. And we're, this is kind of something that we want to keep going with as well. The interviews, it's been really insightful to get to speak to multiple people in teams who are responsible for targets within companies, and we'd like to expand the companies that we've talked to over the course of the rest of the year and going forward as well, because I think it's really going to be very important to track a lot of these developments over time, and given the nature of the problem that we're dealing with.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, I want to come back to the other main area in the report. So we've coming to offsetting, Kaya. I think just it'd be great if you could tell us a little bit more about what these leadership practices look like. What are the leading businesses doing in offsetting? And should they be offsetting at all? What else should they be doing? What should leadership look like in this area?
Yeah, really, really great question. And I think that speaks to the question in the slide, which are like, what are some of the biggest challenges? Offsetting is such an emerging, shifting landscape right now. We just had sort of Article 6 get resolved in many ways at COP, which kind of lay some groundwork for how the voluntary carbon market could interact with the national, carbon markets, and where we need to be making sure that we retire credits from one, so they don't end up in another. And so people were sort of holding their breath, waiting for that negotiation to happen. And then now we see the emergence of these voluntary carbon market integrity initiatives. And so companies are sort of like, the companies we interviewed were very, I should say, the leaders we interviewed are very nervous about selecting offsets right now ahead of some of the guidelines that have yet to come out. One of our interviewees described it as a circular firing squad of all your best friends as soon as you announce that you've invested in an offset project, because everyone has different things that they want from offsets. And then plenty of people think we shouldn't be offsetting at all. And that could be very justified. So the first question we really tried to tackle in the report is exactly that one, whether and what. So kind of a lot of the aim of offsetting, there's sort of common agreement that you shouldn't be offsetting unless the emissions are hard to abate. And so how you define what those residual emissions are in your portfolio of your decarbonization portfolio, where you've done mostly what you can, or you think you're going to be able to do mostly what you can, and then there's this kind of residual of emissions that are really kind of hard or expensive to abate. How companies are defining that, there needs to be a lot more transparency from companies in their net zero strategies about how they're defining that. Understandably, they want to wait for these, guidelines to come out so they can just follow those. But in the meantime, if they are offsetting, they should be saying how they're defining those residuals. So one way that companies are doing this is to sort of look at the marginal abatement curves and the cost, and to say if the costs are really high on an area of emissions, or if they expect them to be high, then that's where the residuals would fall. Another way that companies are doing this is actually just letting it play out. They're saying we're going to delay our offsetting kind of portfolio design until the 2030s, when we will have hopefully done quite a lot of emissions reductions, and then we'll know what's hard to abate because we just tried to do it. And that's a kind of interesting approach that we heard from our interviews where, a company is saying, we'll wait to 2037 and then we'll put the offset market will have matured, our emissions reduction technology will have matured. But the debate with that, of course, then we've got all this like potential money that we need to sort of like flood. If the other purpose of offsetting is to fill gaps in climate financing, which we of course desperately need to fill now, then that doesn't really work to fill in that aim. So there are, again, offsetting is trying to do a lot of things, and you have to decide as a company what you want it to do and make those kind of hard decisions as to what or when to offset. And then there's other companies that feel because of the type of sector that they're in, maybe they have a lot of luxury emissions, that if they're offsetting, they have failed. And so that was an interesting view that we heard from our interviews as well. They're planning to try to reduce the emissions as much as possible, giving themselves the kind of like loophole that they might have to offset, but they are hoping not to have to. So that's the what and the when. And then the how of offsetting was also really, really interesting in our report. That's another area where we saw tensions and trade-offs between the values of a carbon credit itself. So some companies, and this was really interesting, some companies are more likely to offset based on kind of what they're comfortable with. So we found in the tech sector, a lot of the kind of emphasis was on offsets, some avoided emissions offsets where they know for sure, because this emission didn't happen, that it didn't happen. So they can quantify that. Sorry. Sorry, my family always calls right in the middle of stuff. So the question on how to offset, this company was thinking, oh, okay, I know that if this kind of methane investment that we had where there was no methane emitted, that was really good for our data. We know it didn't happen. But then you're kind of sacrificing other things, like maybe people want to restore nature as part of their offset, or maybe they want to ensure kind of long-term storage. Avoided emissions offsets don't have any storage. And so then the food and ag companies were much more interested in kind of offsets or credits, or in many cases insets, kind of within what they're comfortable with. They know that they can work with soil, they know that they can work with nature because their farmers are in their supply chain. So they were kind of leaning towards those types of offsets because that's more what they know. And then this question of how to kind of place conditions around offsets. What we saw was the need for a lot more transparency from companies just about how they're thinking through this problem, and then what trade-offs and values system they're using to make those design portfolio decisions. And it was really, really interesting to see companies say that they are waiting to hear from the guidelines on this, but also they had to kind of shoot from the hip in some places. And I think what that showed us is that the offsetting market, the voluntary carbon market, has yet to move from a system where people are kind of shopping around. They're going one-to-one on, a ton of carbon, $1 here. So this cost benefit analysis system that might not get us to net zero, because that's not a very good accounting system. And I think that companies are starting to ask more about an outcomes-based system where we look at actually where are the gaps globally in our climate finance. So one company who's not choosing to offset as a compensation for their emissions, they're choosing to invest in carbon credits as a contribution to a separate target around nature. So they've joined this coalition called the LEAF Coalition, and they're not actually counting it towards their scope 1 through 3 emissions. So I thought that was really interesting. We're seeing a split between compensation and contribution in offsetting.
Thank you so much, Kaya, for that deep dive. I'm just aware of time, and we have a really great question in the chat from Sarah and a couple of other related questions around challenges and what leadership practices might be the most difficult. Mariah, I'd love to hear your response, particularly to Sarah's question, but to the others as well, around what are the most difficult leadership practices for businesses to adopt, and questions around challenges to collaboration within and between organizations.
Absolutely. I want to actually start by picking up on something that Kaya said, and then come to Sarah's question more directly. So I think implicit in what Kaya was talking about was the complexity and the variation in not just how offsetting is being done, but in the for any one firm the set of considerations that are there in those kinds of decisions. And what I heard you saying was very much that the leading firms are really acknowledging and embracing that and then making particular choices. And I think that's a really important, I would say, leadership practice of the individuals involved in those decisions, right? Which is the willingness to embrace the complexity, right? To acknowledge that there are trade-offs here, that there are difficult choices, and then to be transparent, obviously within limits, about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And we then, as outsiders, right, need to recognize that what makes sense for one firm or one industry will be quite different potentially from what makes sense for another. And so there's complexity and nuance that we as people who patron and who evaluate firms need to acknowledge and accept, right? That it's not, unfortunately, going to be just one kind of solution. It's definitely not a sort of a one size fits all. And I think that does, I'll now link this to Sarah's question about the really difficult challenges of making these kinds of changes. And one piece of that is that they're not simple. There's not one answer. There's not only one perspective. There's a lot of complexity here, and they're difficult choices to be made. And the way that one firm does this won't make sense for another firm. And Sarah, I think a piece of what you're asking about is that for some businesses in particular, reaching net zero will require a fundamental rethink, as you say, of their practices. Their very reason for being might feel like it's called into question, right? And so that is extraordinarily challenging. But again, that will be more so in some sectors than others, for some firms more so than others. And that's something that we need to acknowledge and really focus on, which is once the commitment is there, that in some ways is the easy part. But how do you fundamentally transform an entire organization to think differently, to act differently, to run itself differently in its core practices? And that's something that many of us spend our careers studying how to do, and how to develop leaders who can navigate a firm through that kind of process. It's not easy. There are no easy answers, right? Again, back to the complexity. But recognizing what's at stake, right, is asking people to rethink what's their career going to be like, what kind of jobs are we going to have, what is our purpose as a firm. It is really fundamental transformation. I think the first and most important thing is to acknowledge, to embrace that, and then to move forward carefully, thoughtfully, with a willingness to work together within the firm, across boundaries, but also with our competitors and so on.
Great, thanks so much, Mariah. I have a final question for the chat, but sorry, not for the chat, for all of you, but before we come to that, any responses, Kaya or Aoife? And also, if you have any responses to Fides's question around the comparative study around greenwashing, I don't know.
Yeah, just to kind of pick up on this point about kind of transparency and openness. I mean, this is something that that we've seen the leading companies and kind of the leaders within those companies be able to do. So it's coming out, setting a very ambitious target, for example, and being very honest about the fact that we do not know how to get there. And that in itself kind of being an opportunity then to engage with others in ways that that changes things beyond kind of the boundaries of that single organization. And I think that's where we need to see much braver moves at all levels, and an enabling environment that allows for that as well. And I think that's where Kaya and I are very interested in kind of looking at leadership in its broadest sense, because we need to have these leaders everywhere, as Mariah said, even kind of in the customers, us as people who are buying goods and services, and just thinking through what our role is in putting pressure on companies and to change and to have this kind of opportunity to really shift their mindsets. I think the other thing that I would say is, and I think this is a really interesting thing about climate and thinking about scopes, because one company's scope 2 emissions might be another company's scope 3, and these connections between kind of the the scopes in terms of kind of the boundaries of different companies, it actually facilitates us in thinking in much more connected ways. And I think that can be a really big opportunity rather than this huge headache. And I think we need to probably also be talking in those ways to companies in different industries about, this is a really good opportunity now to be on the front foot and to be leaning in at a time when you can really make progress and shift kind of the way that your industry and indeed other industries work. And so I think that's that's obviously really challenging, right? That doesn't answer the question of how to do it, but I think this openness, transparency, engaging across kind of different types of stakeholders and with governments and thinking in a much more connected way. I think that's kind of a really big opportunity of doing this and doing it in a way that gets us to net zero collectively.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think the openness, the transparency, and the discussion about how to offset, how to kind of define scope, that serves another purpose, which is really, really critical, which we saw over and over from our interviews in this report, which is to help close the skills gap. How better to help teach people how to do this and to, develop good carbon management professionals than to talk openly about how companies are doing this. You pique people's interest when you say, well, we really struggled with this decision as a company, and here's where we fell down, feel free to disagree with us. And then you're teaching your employees because they're interested in the target of the company. And ultimately, we have this huge skills gap in both offsetting and scope. In offsetting, they had, or actually in insetting, one company shared that they'd put out a request for proposals across their entire supply chain. And they had all this money to burn up to try to kind of invest in carbon removal projects. And they didn't have enough people kind of bidding in their supply chain. That's a really difficult position that they're in, and they need to invest in skills capacity building. And then on the scope side, a similar thing, if you are engaging with your supply chain to try to make sure that part of your net zero target is there, then they need to have the skills. So if you can demonstrate kind of the leadership and that decision making, you can help sort of fill in that gap as well, which I think also has an SDG and equity perspective too. You can be building local capacity in places where there may be not the kind of education or programming that we receive at Oxford.
Thanks so much. Okay, aware of time, I have one final question. And I'm thinking a little bit about Bruce's question in the chat around the complexity of these situations and sort of the role of business in the system. I think a lot of what we've been discussing today sounds, like a very different role to how we might traditionally think about the role of business in society. And I think we've been touching on an evolving role for business, but also for individual companies. And I just love to hear a final thought from each of you on that evolving role, of business in society, but also of business vis-a-vis all these other actors in the system. So not just the consumer, but also government, regulators, civil society, how they are collaborating with those other systems actors, what else they should be doing. And, what we should be doing to maybe change the rules of the game even more, thinking about policy, but other things we could do as well.
I'm happy to jump in to start. I was noticing Bruce's comment as well, or question as well. And I wanted to just highlight, I think there are some places where people are certainly drawing on work on complex systems, complex adaptive systems, to understand how to address or how to get to net zero and really how to address the climate crisis more generally. I would also emphasize that there are many ways to think about the kind of complexity that we're talking about. And one is sort of more in a technical sense, which is very important, and equally important, I think, but perhaps not as frequently in these conversations, is really from a human perspective and the way in which we as individuals sort of grapple with complexity, with the sense of sort of competing priorities and demands, not just the way we cognitively understand and technically approach the system of interdependencies. And so we want to be thinking both about the technical complexity and the way we as individuals make sense of, react to, and process that as humans. And both of those are really important, but the second often is not as much in the conversation as I think it probably needs to be. And I think then that raises, back to Jessica's sort of parting question to us about rethinking the role of business as part of this complex system and how we might usefully do that and move forward with that in mind. One thing that I find useful to think about here is the different roles that firms can play, that governments can play in this system of interdependencies that has lately been the source of much of our problems, but also is the source of the potential solution. And there are distinct roles, right? We're not going to each one do all of this, right? But collectively, we have the potential. And so one core role that business plays is in the doing, right? In the, what I call the operationalizing, right? Whether that's developing new products and services, new ways of working, continuing with those that have worked well in the past. All of that is in the operationalizing, but there's also a role for bringing together and convening, and a role for what I would call highlighting or putting a spotlight on, raising awareness of the problems, the potential solutions, the new innovations. And firms often are anchored in the operationalizing, but can increasingly, and I think this is the change that's needed, be leaders in doing some of that convening, doing some of that highlighting work to bring others together across business, government, civil society in this system and towards a better solution.
Yeah, just to build on what Mariah said, I think for me, this goes back to thinking about what we're calling the report now. So this kind of distinction that we make between a net zero business and my business for net zero. And I think we're getting to the point where some companies are starting to make this shift, and we need to have approaches for companies to be able to assess, their own company's activities and how they're contributing individually. But at the same time, we need to make this shift to being focused on collective outcomes. And I think we're not really at the point where we're doing that well enough in terms of how companies are being held to account on climate, actually. So there's a lot of focus on individual target setting, for example. And one of the things that we recommend coming out of the report is to think a bit more carefully about collective types of goals and targets, and how can we do those more creatively in ways that integrate the activities and the target setting that the companies have been very active at developing, particularly in the last 3 to 5 years. So I think there's a lot of learning that has happened in the last couple of years. We're gaining momentum, but I think this disconnect between kind of a focus on what individual organizations are doing and these different kind of levels of collective kind of action that we need. I think that to me is where we need to be really kind of pushing forward in thinking about the role of business in addressing climate and indeed other challenges.
Thanks so much, Kaya. We have 1 more minute. The floor is yours. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I have an acronym to leave with everyone who's thinking about how do I quickly evaluate a net zero strategy. And you can evaluate it by thinking of the acronym SCORE. You need to look at scope, you need to look at coverage, you need to look at offsetting, you need to look at reporting, and you need to look at equity. And if you have those kind of 5 pillars in your strategy, you're part of the way there. And I think, yeah, I really look forward to getting you all the reports so we can go into at least 2 of those pillars.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thanks everyone for your thoughts in the chat as well. Like Kaya said, we'll share the report with all of you as soon as it's out, so don't worry about that. I also just wanted to thank Charmian Love, who was also instrumental in helping us shape this seminar and unfortunately couldn't be here today. So thank you, Charmian. And just a final note to say, we have these every month, these seminars, so please join us next month, although it's in early March, for our next seminar, which is a book talk with Professor Chris Marquis on his book, Better Business, which is all about how the B Corp movement is remaking capitalism. It's going to be fantastic. The 4th of March, we'll share the link to register after this. So please join us then. Thanks again. Thank you, Aoife. Thank you, Kaya. Thank you, Mariah. This is fantastic. Have a really good weekend, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.